Tahu had always been known as a quiet man. Among the Apache, where silence was often more valued than speech, Tahu's stillness went even deeper, not just quiet, but heavy, like something pressed down his shoulders and held him in place. He had been a scout in his youth, a skilled tracker with eyes that could spot a broken twig or the faintest shadow out of place. But as the years passed and the pace of war slowed, Tahu faded into the rhythm of the village, a man who did his work, spoke only when needed, and kept mostly to himself. No one suspected that beneath his silence, something monstrous had begun to grow. It started as a small swelling on the inside of his upper left thigh, no larger than a bead. He had noticed it one morning after returning from a hunt, a tiny bulge beneath the skin, barely worth a second thought. It didn't hurt, it didn't itch, it simply existed, an oddity of the body like the knotted fingers of the old or the tremble in the hands of the medicine man. So, Tao ignored it. He had bigger concerns: the shifting tension between the tribes, the dying buffalo herds, the younger warrior's restlessness. He had no time to nurse a bruise. Weeks passed. The lump remained. Then it grew. Slowly, steadily, until it became impossible to forget. It no longer fit under his leggings without discomfort. His gait changed slightly, almost imperceptibly, but the elders noticed. "Old wounds," he would mutter when asked. They nodded with respect. In truth, Tahu had never been wounded in war. He had dodged arrows, spears, even bullets, but this thing inside him, this swelling, was a war of another kind, a quiet one, and Tahu chose to face it the only way he knew, alone. He never told the women who sometimes visited his fire. He never mentioned it to the healer who tended to the village's sick. When he bathed in the river, he waited until dusk. When no one else came near, if children approached while he was seated, he shifted his body to block the bulge from view. There was shame in it, not the shame of illness, but of mystery. It was unnatural. It felt wrong, like it did not belong to him, yet clung to him with growing strength. At times, in the deep of night, he felt it pulse, not in pain, but in movement, as if something beneath the skin stirred of its own will. Seasons changed. Snow came, then, melted. The swelling grew harder, like a bone where no bone should be. Tahu began to limp, ever so slightly, only when walking long distances, only when tired. His horse sensed his discomfort and adjusted its pace accordingly, a silent kindness from a loyal creature. But Tahu felt the eyes of the younger men. He was no longer the tireless scout. Whispers began. Some said he was cursed by the mountain spirits for killing too many Comanche. Others said the spirits were trying to speak through him, and he was refusing to listen. In the council meetings, Tao remained quiet, not out of disinterest, but because the pain, now sharper, more insistent, had become a distraction. It came in waves. At times it throbbed, as though a second heartbeat lived in his thigh. He tried pressing it down, binding it with cloth, soaked in cooled ash. Nothing worked. The healer noticed his discomfort once and offered to examine it, but Tahu refused. He waved it off with a grunt and walked away. Pride, the healer thought, but it was not pride. It was fear, not fear of death. Tahu had seen death, had sat with dying warriors, had buried children struck by fever. He did not fear the end. What he feared was the unknown, the growing suspicion that what lived inside his flesh was not of this world, that it had shape, will, perhaps even a purpose. Dreams began to come more frequently. Strange dreams. He would find himself standing in a dark river, up to his chest, unable to move, while something brushed his leg beneath the water. Other times he dreamed of a cave, pulsing with heat, and something trying to crawl out of it, something wet, breathing, whispering. The voice was not one he recognized, but it always said the same word, brother. He would wake with a start, sweat soaking his bedroll, hand clutching the leg where the swelling pulsed like a trapped bird. He began avoiding others more intentionally. When women brought him food, he accepted it through the door and gave thanks, but did not invite them to sit. He no longer hunted in groups. He asked a boy to fetch his water. Rumors grew darker. The children were told not to wander near his hut. After sundown, some believed he had gone mad. Others said he was carrying a demon that fed on solitude. Tahu said nothing to confirm or deny. What could he say? That he believed something was living in him. That sometimes, when he was alone and still, he felt it pressing back against his touch. There were moments when he considered taking a knife and cutting it out himself. He had even prepared, laying out a blade, a jar of alcohol, a burning ember to cauterize. But when he tried, his hand shook, not from fear of pain, but from a deeper instinct, as if his body knew that what he carried could not be removed so easily, that it had roots, that it would not allow itself to be cast out without a price. One day, a passing Chiricahua healer came to the village, old, with skin like cracked leather and a staff decorated with feathers. The man had healed fever in the children and set a warrior's broken arm. When he passed by Tahu's hut, he paused, sniffed the air, and muttered something in his own tongue. Later that night, he knocked on Tahu's door. Reluctantly, Tahu let him in. The healer placed his hand on Tahu's leg, closed his eyes, and whispered an old prayer. When he opened his eyes again, They were wide with concern. "You carry something," he said softly. "It is not sickness. It is not flesh. It is waiting." Tahu looked away. "Then let it wait. You must release it," the healer said, "or it will release itself in a way none will forget." But Tahu could not bear the thought. What if it was some punishment? What if it was clinging to him for some forgotten sin? What if it was the price he had paid for surviving when so many others had not? He lived on, as he always had, quiet, strong, carrying the growing thing in his leg, pretending it was merely a wound he could outlast. But in truth, the waiting was almost over. Something deep within his body had begun to stir in earnest. And the day of reckoning, the day when the silence would be shattered, was closer than he dared imagine. The storm that night rolled in like a warning. Thunder cracked across the desert sky, echoing off the stone cliffs that bordered the village like silent sentinels. The wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human, high-pitched and mournful, as if the land itself had begun to grieve. Rain had not touched the Apache land in over 2 moons, but tonight it fell hard and fast, drumming on the hides of lodges, soaking the earth that had grown dry and cracked. The people stayed indoors, whispering prayers, eyes turned upward. Storms came and went, but this one felt different, heavier, meaner, as if something buried had stirred. Inside his hut, Tahu lay on his side, sweat slicking his brow, despite the cold wind leaking through the animal skin walls. His leg, the cursed leg, throbbed with a sharpness that felt new, raw. The pain had been building for days, but now it had reached a point beyond endurance. It no longer pulsed like a wound. It screamed like a thing trying to be born. His breath came in shallow gasps. His fingers clawed at the woven mat beneath him. Every time he moved, the agony flared up his spine. It felt like his leg was going to split open. Something inside pushed outward, not like a fluid or swelling of flesh, but with force, like knuckles against skin. He could feel it shifting, adjusting itself inside his thigh. It was alive. That was the only word that fit. He tried to sit up, but his vision blurred. Blood roared in his ears. A low sound escaped his throat, part growl, part plea. He had faced mountain lions. He had once walked 4 miles with an arrowhead lodged in his back. But this was no natural pain. This was not a wound that could be stitched shut. This was something else. Then it happened. A sudden, sickening pop tore through the silence, followed by a hot rush of fluid. Tahu screamed, a sound so guttural, so filled with anguish, that the nearby dogs began to howl in unison. The skin of his leg had burst, splitting along a jagged line like a fruit left too long in the sun. But what poured out was not blood alone. It was thick, viscous, and dark, laced with something far more horrifying. He gasped and looked down, and what he saw turned his stomach. A small limb, pale and malformed, dangled from the open wound. A curled hand, tiny, gray-clawed, not human, not entirely. Tahu scrambled back in panic, dragging himself across the floor, leaving a smear of blood behind him. But the thing did not stop emerging. Inch by inch, piece by piece, it slid from him like a stillborn child, except twisted and wrong. The head came next, oversized and oddly shaped, with no hair, no clear facial features except for a gaping mouth and sunken ridges where eyes should have been. The skin was thin, almost translucent. Veins pulsed faintly beneath it. The creature's body was small, maybe the size of a jackrabbit, curled up like a fetus. One leg was deformed, bent inward, fused at the joint. The other was fully formed and twitched once, feebly, before falling still. Tahu could not move, could not think. For the first time in his life, he was paralyzed by something deeper than pain, deeper than fear. It was as if the world had tilted, as if reality had cracked and something impossible had slipped through. His mind raced to understand, to name it, categorize it, fit it into a story the old ones might have told. But nothing came. No tale of a spirit child birthed from a warrior. No legend of a twin left behind in the womb. This thing, whatever it was, defied every rule of body and spirit he had known. The hut smelled of blood and something else. Something foul and sour, like rotten eggs and wet stone. The air shimmered. He thought he heard whispering, a soft murmured chant in a language he didn't recognize. He pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices were inside his head. Then, the creature twitched again. Only once. A spasm, but enough to send a jolt through Tahu's body. He backed into the corner of the hut, gasping, heart pounding like a drum. It was dead. It had to be. Yet something in him knew. This thing had lived inside him. Had grown inside him, for years, feeding, sleeping, dreaming alongside him. It had borrowed his body, his warmth, his blood. What was it? A lost twin, deformed and trapped. A spirit born of guilt, taking form in flesh. A curse laid on him by an enemy long forgotten. Or was it a part of him, the part he had never dared to face? Tahu wrapped a blanket around himself and wept. Not from the pain, though it still throbbed, but from the deep soul-cracking realization that he had carried this burden for so long, and had no idea what it truly was, and worse, that he had been chosen for it. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Lightning illuminated the cliffs, casting long shadows across the village. Thunder boomed like the voice of an angry god, but within Tahu's hut, a quieter storm had passed, one made of blood, bone, and secrets finally set free. He did not sleep that night. He watched the creature's still body until dawn, waiting for it to move again, for it to speak, to do something to explain itself. But it remained still, silent, as if, having been born into the world, it had no more need for him. And yet, even in its silence, it spoke volumes. The elder's judgment. By the time the sun rose over the jagged ridges of the eastern hills, word had already begun to spread. In Apache villages, news traveled without messengers. A subtle shift in the air, a strange wind, or the sudden silence of the birds could alert a people accustomed to listening beyond sound. And this morning, everything was off. The dogs barked and then fell quiet. The ravens circled but refused to land. Something had happened, and by mid-morning, the elders had gathered at Tahu's hut, not because they were summoned, but because the land itself seemed to call them. Tahu stood outside, pale and unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, the torn hide of his leg wrapped in stained cloth. His hand shook as he lifted a bundle carefully wrapped in woven bark and buckskin and laid it gently on a flat stone just beyond his doorstep. The wind tugged at the edge of the cloth, but he didn't move to secure it. Let them see. Let them judge. The village had never seen him like this. Strong, stoic, Tahu, the scout who once outran horses and read tracks like scripture, now looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. Lines carved his face. His shoulders sagged, not with pain, but with the weight of something far older, far heavier. The thing he had carried inside him for over 20 years now lay silent before the tribe. One by one, the elders stepped forward. Most were wrapped in ceremonial shawls, beads clinking softly, feathers trembling in the breeze. Head elder, Nanten knelt first. His hair was white as sun-bleached bone. His sight nearly gone, but he still had the gift of sensing things the eye could not see. He opened the bundle slowly. The silence that followed was unlike any the village had ever known. It was a silence that swallowed breath, a silence that crept into the marrow. The thing was clearly not human, but neither was it entirely inhuman. It was the size of a newborn child, its skin a pale gray, almost translucent. The limbs were shriveled, but one hand was fully formed, clenched tight as if it had died, grasping something invisible. The head was large, with the faint shadow of a mouth and sunken, hollow sockets where eyes might have been. No one spoke. Not yet. You looked at Nantan, then at the others. It came from me, he said finally, voice hoarse. Last night, during the storm. It tore itself out, the elders murmured, forming a loose circle around the stone. Some crossed their arms. Others touched fingers to their temples in quiet prayer. One old woman, Molly, gasped and turned her back, whispering, the dreaming flesh. It has returned. That caught Nanton's attention. You remember? He asked. She turned slowly, her voice shaking. My grandmother told me stories. From before even her time, a warrior once carried something like this in his body. He had killed his own brother. In battle, and the spirit of that sin, it found form in him. Not as a wound, but as a twin, a twisted child made of guilt. Nantan turned his clouded eyes toward Tahu. Have you killed a brother? Tahu flinched. No blood of mine. Blood is not only of mothers, the old man said. It can be of spirit, of path. Have you slain someone whose death has followed you? The question struck deeper than Tahu expected. Faces from the past flickered through his memory. Warriors fallen, enemies struck down in darkness, friends lost to betrayal. He remembered one fight in particular, a young Comanche scout he had ambushed during a raid. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. His eyes had been bright with fear, his hands empty when Tahu's knife found his chest. He hadn't needed to die. Tahu had silenced that memory for years. I killed someone, young he admitted. Long ago, unarmed. It was war, but I felt no pride. The elders nodded gravely. Nanton's voice dropped. Then perhaps this is not just a thing of flesh. Perhaps it is a spirit given form by shame. Carried inside you, growing, feeding. Others offered their own theories. One claimed it was a cursed twin, never born, now released. Another insisted it was a skinwalker's trap, placed on Tahu by an enemy shaman. Still others argued that Tahu had been chosen, not cursed, to carry something sacred and forgotten. A spirit caught between worlds needing flesh to cross over. But whatever they believed, one thing was clear. The thing was unnatural, and its appearance was a sign. The village had suffered years of drought, strange animal deaths, dreams filled with fire and crying children. Now this, the elders saw connection where others saw coincidence. For them, the emergence of this creature was not random. It was a warning, a reckoning. They debated long into the afternoon. The thing could not be buried that would trap its spirit in the soil, nor could it be cast into water that might carry its curse downstream. Burning was the only answer. Fire purifies. Fire severs spirit from flesh and sends it back to the stars. But before that, Nantan decreed, it must be seen, not just by them, but by the people. The tribe must understand what has happened. He said, "They must know what has been carried among us." Tao protested, shame rising in his throat. "No, let it be gone. Let me forget." Nantan turned to him, soft but firm. "You carried it. Now we carry it with you. That is the way of our people." And so, as dusk settled, the bundle was laid on a raised hide platform near the center of the village. One by one, the people came, men, women, children, all drawn by something they could not name. Some gasped, others wept, a few turned away, but all felt the weight of what they saw: a child who never lived, a monster who was never meant to be born, a mystery shaped in flesh. An old man whispered, "If it had eyes, it would have looked just like him." A woman beside him muttered, "Then, perhaps it was him, the part he buried." And that, more than anything, unsettled them. By the time the last villager stepped away, the stars had begun to emerge above the mountains. The air was cold, still, the wind had died. Tahu stood at the edge of the circle, his face expressionless. Inside, he was splintered, but outwardly, he was the man they knew, standing, silent, watching. What he felt was not just shame, not just horror, but a strange, creeping sense that something inside him had ended, or perhaps, something new had just begun. The night of the burning came with an eerie calm. No wind stirred the trees, no insects hummed in the sagebrush. Even the owls, those constant watchers of the dark, remained hidden. The villagers gathered slowly around the ceremonial circle just beyond the northern ridge, where burials and fire rites were held when something beyond understanding entered or left their world. Tonight, it was not a warrior or a chief who was to be honored, but a creature no one dared name. Born not of a mother, but of pain, guilt, and silence. The pyre was built from sacred mesquite wood and sage branches, laid in a careful spiral that the firekeeper had woven together by hand. At the center, a stone slab had been placed, the same stone where the creature had first been revealed to the tribe. Now it served as an altar, or perhaps a cradle, for something that had never belonged here. You stood apart from the others, just at the tree line, leaning heavily on a walking stick. His legs still throbbed beneath the wrapped bandages, though the swelling had subsided. The wound left behind wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, and that hollow sensation, that gaping void just above his knee, seemed to echo with every heartbeat. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that something had lived inside him for so long, or that it had finally left. He had not spoken all day, not to the healers who checked the wound, not to the woman who brought him broth, not to the boy who tried to hand him a carved rabbit for comfort. His voice had dried up like a streamed hall. His thoughts turned inward to that stormy night, to the soft twitch of a malformed hand, to the way the elders' faces paled as they beheld the bundle. Was it his shame that took form, a punishment, a spirit parasite, or something even darker, something older than language? Nantan raised his staff as twilight thickened, signaling silence. The firekeeper, a tall, quiet man named Koyez, stepped forward and began the ritual chant, his voice low and rhythmic. He circled the pyre, sprinkling sacred ash and crushed juniper, whispering the old words taught to him by his grandfather. Then he knelt and opened the final bundle. A murmur passed through the gathered crowd. Even after a day in the open air, the creature hadn't decayed. Its skin remained stretched and smooth, like wax. Its fingers were curled tightly, and the mouth, if it was a mouth, still gaped in that soundless scream. Some villagers turned their eyes away. Others whispered prayers. The children were held close by their mothers, who hushed them sternly if they spoke. Koyas placed the creature gently onto the pyre center. Then, without fanfare, he lit the edge of the wood. The flame caught slowly, climbing the dry sage first, sending sweet, earthy smoke into the night. Sparks lifted into the dark like fireflies fleeing the earth. Tahu felt his breath catch. Every part of him wanted to run, or scream, or throw himself into the fire to tear the thing back from it. But he remained still, rooted by something heavier than fear. The flame spread inward. When it touched the creature, something strange happened. The fire didn't crackle, it hissed, like water on iron. A foul-smelling steam rose, thicker and blacker than ordinary smoke. It curled into the air and hung there, forming odd shapes before disappearing. Some villagers gasped. Others backed away. Then came the sound, a high-pitched keening, almost like a baby's wail, echoed across the circle. It didn't come from the fire. It came through it, as if the heat had cracked open a door between this world and something else. The sound climbed in pitch and volume until people clutched their ears. Several fell to their knees. Elders began chanting loudly, trying to drown it out. Tahu did not move. His eyes were fixed on the flames. Then just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The fire roared higher, engulfing the twisted body in a pillar of light. The bundle collapsed into itself, bones popping, skin blackening, then turning to ash. The wind returned, sweeping the remains up in a swirl of sparks that vanished into the stars. Silence followed. Not the frightened silence from before. This one felt sacred. Finished, clean. Nantan stepped into the circle and raised both arms. "It is done," he said. "What was hidden is now gone. But let none forget. It came from us. It lived among us. It was shaped by our silence and our wounds. Let this fire remind us, nothing hidden stays buried forever. The people bowed their heads, some wept quietly. Others stood in contemplation. Only Tahu remained motionless. His eyes were dry, but his soul was raw. As the villagers began to drift away, many pausing to lay small tokens, feathers, stones, strips of cloth near the edge of the fire pit, Tahu finally stepped forward. He walked into the circle, ignoring the curious looks. He approached the ash pile and knelt beside it, letting the heat kiss his face. He reached into the remains and pulled free a small piece of charred bone, perhaps a rib, perhaps a finger. It was blackened, hollow, fragile. He held it in his palm for a long moment. Then he lifted it to his lips and whispered 3 words. I release you. And as he said them, something deep within him, something he hadn't known was clenched, finally let go. A cry split the night, but this one came not from the fire, not from Tahu, not from any person. It was an animal's cry, a howl, from the hills. Every head turned. On the ridgeline just above the fire circle stood a lone coyote. Its eyes glowed in the firelight. It did not run. It did not lower its head. It simply stood and watched, unblinking, as if acknowledging what had just transpired. Tahu met its gaze. In Apache belief, the coyote is many things: trickster, teacher, wanderer, between worlds. To see one at such a moment was not taken lightly. The coyote howled once more, then turned and vanished into the darkness. The old woman, Molly, whispered, he was watching, the spirit who walks the edges. And some nodded, wondering aloud, if the creature had truly burned, or if its soul had merely changed form, released into the wild, into the wind, into the animal who had come to witness its passing. Tahu turned and limped back toward the trees. He did not look back. The thing was gone, but he knew the story was far from over. The return of the dreamers in the weeks following the fire, Tahu withdrew further into solitude. His leg healed in layers, first the flesh, then the sinew, but the ache that remained was not the kind that medicine could treat. It was a wound of spirit. The fire may have consumed the creature, and the elders may have spoken their prayers, but Tahu knew something had shifted that night, something deep beneath the visible world. He could feel it each morning when he stepped outside his hut, and in the evenings, when shadows stretched long and strange across the dry grass. The world had noticed what happened, and now, it was watching. At first, it was subtle. Birds no longer nested near his dwelling. The deer trails that once cut through the nearby creek bed grew cold. Even the insects, which usually came in clouds after summer rains, seemed to skirt the edges of his home, as if an invisible barrier now surrounded it. Children who once brought him wildflowers or small gifts were kept away by cautious mothers. And when Tahu passed through the village square, whispers fell into the folds of shawls. Eyes turned quickly away. He had not been cast out, but he had become something else. Something uncertain. Still, it wasn't isolation that unsettled him most. It was the dreams. They began quietly. Faint images, flickers. At first he dreamed of the fire again, of the creature rising from it whole, its skin wet and gray, eyes empty, floating above the flame before turning its head toward him and opening its clenched hand. But as the nights wore on, the visions deepened, they lengthened, and they changed. He saw himself walking through a desert with no end, his leg dragging behind him like a broken animal. The sun overhead was black, the sky churned, and ahead, in the dust, were hundreds, maybe thousands, of figures crawling. Twisted, limping, faceless, they reached toward him, whispering without mouths. One night, he saw a tree, alone, in a blood-colored field from which hung 100 infant-sized bundles, swaying in wind that never touched his skin. In each bundle, something moved. He would wake covered in sweat, clutching his leg, breath ragged. And always, from outside, came the sound of movement. Rustling in the grass. Footsteps that stopped when he opened the door. A presence, heavy and waiting. One night, just before the new moon, he couldn't take it anymore. He left his hut and walked into the hills. He didn't take food, he didn't take water, just a single blade and a woven blanket. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to leave the edge of the village to find the place where the earth had stopped listening. He needed answers, or peace, or perhaps punishment. He walked for 3 days, through high passes, across dry riverbeds, over stone, and thorn. On the 3rd night, he collapsed near a place the elders called the Whispering Basin, a deep hollow in the earth surrounded by stones shaped like teeth. No one lived there, no one even visited. But something drew him toward it, the same way a wound draws flies. The moment he stepped into its rim, the wind vanished. He sat on a flat rock and waited, and then they came. At first he thought they were shadows, but the moon had not risen. The dark was pure. These figures, though, glided along the ground like fog. No footfalls, no breath. 4 of them, then 6, then 10. They formed a loose circle around him, not close, but near enough. He could feel their weight in the air. Their forms were vague, but tall, cloaked in black feathers or dust or something he couldn't describe. Where faces should have been, there were only hollows. One of them stepped forward. Tahu's mouth was dry. He couldn't speak, it didn't need him to dot it, raised its hand, long, skeletal, not human, and pointed to his leg, and in his mind a voice entered, not words, but meaning. You birthed the forgotten, now the forgotten remember you. Tahu closed his eyes, overwhelmed. What was it? He whispered aloud. What was that thing? The response came not in speech, but in sensation. A rush of images, the spirit world turning, a womb of bone, a promise made long ago, broken, a piece of something old forced into him when he was a child, before memory, a seed planted not by hands, but by a dream, and a whisper that echoed from generations past. What is buried in silence takes root in flesh. He saw flashes of others, warriors, women, children, all marked, all walking with parts of themselves twisted by what they could not face, spirits, malformed by grief, shame, betrayal, some turned into madness, others into disease. But a few like him bore their burden into form. Tahu fell forward, clutching the earth. Why me? He wept. The wind picked up finally, cool like breath. The circle of shadows began to dissolve. One remained behind. It bent toward him. A hand touched his head, and the voice entered one last time, because he remembered. Then, it was gone. You lay there until morning. When he arose, the sky was clear. The wind sang. He limped back to the village over the course of 2 days. When he arrived, people stared, not with fear, but with confusion. He looked stronger, clearer. His limp was still there, but he stood tall. He walked to the elders and told them what had happened. The figures, the dreams, the basin, the touch. Nantan listened, then nodded slowly. You were called to the dreamers. Few or even fewer. Return. Who are they? Tahu asked. The ones who carry what we bury. Nantan said, the shapes we give to our silence. They walk the veil and show us what lives beneath skin and stone. And now, the elder looked at him. Now you become one who remembers. For the tribe, you are not cursed. You're a bearer, a witness. Tahu turned his gaze toward the hills, where the basin lay hidden. He had been emptied, but not broken. And now, he would begin the work of healing, not just his body, but the land, the people, and the memories they dared not name.